All right. Well, hello, Stephanie. Thanks so much for taking time to join me today.
Thanks for having me on the podcast.
We've been working to connect across time and across the continent here for a few months now, and I'm so glad we're finally landing in real time together. Um, you wear a lot of hats. You've done a lot of things. I would love to just give you the opportunity to introduce yourself to our listeners. Obviously, we're based here in the Great Lakes region, and you've done work with some organizations that are probably familiar to our listeners and maybe some that might be new. So I'll just pass the mic over to you to give us an introduction.
Yeah, I'm happy to. So I'm currently the Population and Sustainability Director at the Center for Biological Diversity, and we're a national conservation organization. Our mission is essentially to save life on Earth. So we're fighting the extinction crisis. We work to save wildlife and wild places, and of course, all the interconnections that doing so has with human life as well, of course. But before this, I actually started out my career in environmental work in Ann Arbor, Michigan. I was working for the Ecology Center in Ann Arbor, and I was doing fundraising and membership work there, and was just really inspired by all of these connections between not just the local community and the land and the waters around Michigan, but also how that intersects with issues like environmental health and how that ties together. And so I really wanted to get more from, the fundraising side, which is critically important to keep the lights on and get the advocacy work done. But I knew that my heart was really in doing the advocacy work. So I wound up from there working at change.org, and I started out doing writing for them before they really got into being a petition platform. And then I was leading all of their animal and environmental programs. I was one of the leads on those. And I was helping people all around the world start and win these campaigns for such a huge range of projects that could be anything from trying to stop pollution in their community to a dog that was shot by a police officer. There's a horrifying number of instances where that happens. Um, People trying to, protect local wildlife or get more plant-based food on menus. And it was really great to see all the different things that people were passionate about, because I've always been interested in all things animals and the environment. But eventually I knew that I really wanted to be able to like dig in deeper on a particular issue. The work was so broad, and felt like I was in and out of campaigns so much that I really wanted to dig in a bit deeper. And so I was really excited to see that opportunity come up with the Center for Biological Diversity to run their population and sustainability program. And at the time, the center had been working on population for a while. We'd had our endangered species condoms already out there for several years and had been doing a lot of educational work on that. But we really wanted to expand the issue to work with both sides of the coin, both population and consumption. And really what the program does now is we look at the root causes of really the underlying drivers of the extinction crisis, and how does human society and our human systems and industries really drive these threats to wildlife and the environment. And with that comes all of these intersections with things like reproductive rights and environmental justice, and as well as health, and looking at how all of these things intersect with the fight to protect the wild.
Wow. Well, thank you so much for your work. That is a lot of, it's a broad scope that you all are tackling, but again, all the way upstream into the root causes is what we have to do. A lot of my mentors have sort of guided me in that direction from my early days of activism. It's like, well, you have to keep going upstream. I mean, we do need people addressing the symptoms, but we also need a lot of people addressing the root causes and shedding light and doing research. So thank you for doing that. And so great that we have another Ecology Center alumnus on the podcast. Ecology Center is such a wonderful organization, and truly an incubator of really great folks who bring that experience into various other organizations and lines of work. Um, And so, and also with change.org too. I mean, so many of us have come across petitions through change.org, and how cool that you were there, even before it became what we know it to be now. Um, so I'd love to also ask you a little bit about your work as an author. Imagining that a lot of your work with these organizations is connected to that same, desire to be of service and of impact, and to share awareness and research that you've done, and to get to root causes. So, I'd love for you to tell us about your work as a writer, specifically your book, Take Extinction Off Your Plate.
Yeah, so I have several different books out there at this point. And my work as an author, I've always loved writing, and that's been a big piece of who I am. But a few years after I left change.org, I realized that I had all of this knowledge in my head that other people didn't necessarily have about how to take their passion for issues they care about, particularly around animals and the environment, and turn that into action, whether that was individual action, things that they do in their daily lives, or how to start creating campaigns. And so I really had a desire to write this book that, frankly, I wish I had had when I was like 18 or 20, just starting off in this field. Like someone to tell me, you're so passionate about these issues. Here's how you can make a difference. And
Mm,
here's how that difference really adds up to change. The other piece that I really wanted with that was my interests span so many different areas of animal and environmental protection that I wanted to kind of cross-pollinate those, right? Get people who cared about farmed animals to also care about wildlife, or people who cared about the impact of their dogs to care about what was happening to freshwater species, and to really get people to start to understand how these issues were connected, and ways that they could start getting involved beyond sort of their gateway passion into this world. And
mm,
so I wrote The Animal Lover's Guide to Changing the World. And that book really covers a lot of ground, from helping people understand how almost everything we do throughout the day and in our lives affects other species, and how we can start to do so in a more thoughtful and compassionate and effective way to to protect animals and give them better lives too. So that was the first book that I wrote. It's technically an adult book. It's found a lot of young readers as well in high school, up through all ages from there. And so it's written in a really accessible and non-judgmental way. Like, it's meant to meet people where they are. Start wherever you're starting from, with whatever you're most passionate about and with whatever you're able to do now. And I still feel like, in the world that we're in this moment, that is still like such an important message, that it's like, do what you can. Like, just because you can't do everything doesn't mean do nothing. Like, just do something for the world that you want to see. And so that was the first book. And since then, I've written three different series of books for children. They're aimed at grades 4 through 6. And a lot of it is taking these issues that I work on at the Center for Biological Diversity and helping tap into that natural love that kids have for wildlife and the natural world, and help them better understand what that means with their lives as humans, and how they can, and how they can have an impact. So the first series was Take Action, Save Life on Earth. And that one has 6 books on it that features different types of animals, like carnivores and amphibians, as well as a book on native plants and ocean life, and helping kids understand the threats that these species face, as well as what they can do even as kids to help protect these species. The second series of books is called Planet Human, and that's really to help kids understand this massive scale of industries that we have. It covers things like the fashion industry, the plastics industry, agriculture. It even covers pets, because that's become such a massive industry that has a real impact on the planet. And it talks about how these industries have literally changed the face of the planet, and again, how there's a more sustainable path forward. And then the last series of books that was just published in January is called Nature's Secret Superheroes. And Nature's Secret Superheroes, each one features a different species that really transforms the environment around them. So it looks at things like how beavers can completely transform their ecosystems. It looks at the role that vultures play in, the entire life cycle in the environment and that sort of thing. So that one is really just a fun way for kids to really understand the importance of each species and how they fit into that tapestry of life on Earth.
Wow, beautiful. Thank you so much for the overview. Um, I love kind of going back to one of the first things you talked about is just turning passions into action. And that's I feel so strongly about that myself too, because it's often a very thin line in an individual between sort of overwhelm and action. And everybody has different ways that we feel like we see the need for change in the world or in our communities. Like if you talk to anyone, they would have opinions or feelings about changes that they would want to see. And a lot of times there's this tricky spot that people get in, especially when we're young. And now, the younger generation has a whole confluence of crises that is more overwhelming than what I faced, which was very overwhelming as a young person, as a teenager, early 20s. But to sort of go from feeling overwhelmed and not knowing what to do, or feeling like there's too much to do anything, and not knowing how or where to start, to go from that state into action, and then to sort of develop some momentum around turning your passions into action. One of the things that I've done is to do this podcast where I get to talk to people like you who have done just that. And I'm imagining that there are some themes of that in your work with kids. And I'm wondering, what are some of the tools or the ways that you encourage people, or the ways that you sort of distill, the overwhelm of looking at systems crises and like extinction and things like that, living in an age of extinction, into tangible action steps that a young person could take?
Yeah, it's interesting that you mentioned this podcast as a source of action, because it's actually a great example as sort of a proxy of how I often talk about this to young people. Not saying that like a fourth grader can start their own podcast, but the idea that, it's easy to feel, especially when you're young, that I'm just one person. What does it matter what I do? How will it change things? I mean, and frankly, a lot of older people have that too, right? I mean, they feel this frustration with how big these problems are. But the reality is that there are so many benefits from thinking about like what are you doing as an individual to live aligned with your values, and to start educating yourself on the issues that you care about, and to start changing your own habits and practices and lifestyle in ways that support the world that you want to see. And it's so important for several reasons. One, I think it's really important for our own mental health to feel that empowerment, to feel like I know what I'm doing, what I can, that I'm doing what I can. But it's also important because as you start to do these things, people around you notice, right? Your loved ones, your family, your friends, your community. It starts to have a difference. If you change the things that you are consuming or buying, or even how you consume or buy, it starts to have an impact on other people noticing what you're doing. And then that has this ripple effect that can have a larger impact on the community and on the market that builds from there. So starting with what you can do in your own life, with how you work on these issues, how you spread the message about these issues, like you're doing with this podcast, like that's a really important way to start to build that community and help empower others to do the same thing. So that's how we start with them. And community organizing starts with individuals, right? So that's a really important step to do that. And then from there, there's a lot of opportunity to really feel more engaged. It helps to push aside that feeling of of paralysis or disempowerment that you might have, right? That feeling of overwhelm because you are taking action toward these things. And from then you can learn as you're able to, whether you're able to get involved in a, in a way that is more political or in contacting companies and asking them to change their practices, right? There are all these ways that you can go from there, but it really starts with those individual actions and really feeling like you're aligned with your values and that you're, starting to make that difference in your own community.
I love that. Absolutely. And sometimes it's important for people to remember, adults and young people, just that not everyone has access to the same ideas or the same outlook, or maybe we are inspired by someone and we want to be a little bit more that way, and we find meaning and purpose in that. And it could be that the kids we go to school with, they have never been exposed to that idea at all, and we might be the only person that's modeling that way of being or that way of thinking, and that's empowering. um and again, it like builds momentum to sort of walk the talk and be the change. And once you start doing that, you start kind of naturally running into more people who are doing the same, and inspire us to continue on our path. um and so yeah,
Yeah. I mean, so many, sorry.
oh yeah, go ahead.
So many people just don't know where or how to start,
Yeah.
right? So they not know like what the step is, like that what you're doing may never have occurred to them as an option, or even if it's something that's become second nature to you. If you think about kids who grew up, for example, eating more plant-based foods in their homes, and there are other kids whose families do not eat that way, and it may not occur to them that there can be a meal that has a lower impact on the environment or is more animal friendly, that there are actually delicious ways that they can eat beans. Like, it just doesn't occur to them because they've never seen it before. And so sharing that kind of knowledge is that first step to helping people see that, like, this is what it actually looks like to have a shift in behavior. Or if people wanted to start a local letter writing campaign, it may seem obvious to one person, but someone else may not realize that the basic steps of, like, okay, this is how you pick a target and this is how you sit down and write the letter and what it should look like. So that's where sharing that knowledge is just so important. And don't necessarily assume that other people aren't taking action because they don't want to, but they just might not have the knowledge yet.
Yeah, absolutely. I love that. And that opens up possibilities, and it's sort of a humanistic approach too, where we're sort of like shifting out of, I mean, and it's natural to, you learn about this stuff and it brings up some strong emotions. It brings up anger about how we got to this point and how perilous it is. And you look at the effect it has on other species, and it's by no fault of that species that their habitat has been destroyed. Or so it's natural to feel anger, and yet preemptive anger at people who haven't come across the same information or the same ways of thinking is not strategic in terms of building a movement or building awareness. And so, and it's also not humanistic. It's sort of a punitive approach. And yet also these strong emotions can be channeled, right? And I'm still, I mean, I'll be 45 on April 1st, and I'm still trying to find healthy ways to channel my big emotions through my music and through, expression. But to when it's most challenging, to try to meet people where they're at, like you said, is especially powerful. And I've often found that it's really surprising because people have these ideas about what it is to be an environmentalist, or what it is to be an animal lover or animal rights activist. But when you are a human being that defies all of their ideas about what that was, all of a sudden there's like an opening in the sky, and then the light shines down on both of us. It's like, oh, here we are, we're just two people with a story. Our stories have met here in this moment. And I think that approach is something we need to breathe life into. Also, I get, again, like, I get this anger and the righteousness, like I've been there and I go there often. Um, but it also is such a barrier for people taking action now. I run across that in my work with young people, and perhaps you do too, where it's just like, it's too risky to get in there. I'm gonna get taken down as soon as I stand up, you know. Um, and on that topic, I wonder if you can share some tools that you use when you do run across people with basically prejudices about, you know, the titles, the what they associate with someone, or maybe they have created different titles for themselves. Maybe they think of themselves as pro-business or whatever it is. They have a different diet or a different mentality about food and food systems. How do you react or not react when you come across some of these more intense aspects of trying to engage with people?
Yeah, that's a really huge issue. And especially when we talk about food issues, working on food systems is a really big part of my work. And it is challenging because food is more than just what we eat. It's part of our identity, it's part of our cultures. Like it's just wrapped up into so many different elements of our lives and how we see ourselves that people do often have this idea like you're taking away who I am, or you're asking me to change my culture, or these there are all these conceptions around like what is actually being asked of people. Our work on our Take Extinction Off Your Plate work at the Center for Biological Diversity has always been focused on reducing meat and dairy consumption to more sustainable levels. Always reducing. We have never said you have to eliminate it, but from day one, people have always said you're trying to take away all meat, and really, we never said that. Like, right? People get very defensive about it, but so it's definitely a challenge. I think one of the biggest things is, again, that idea of finding common ground, of find out, first of all, what are the things that you care about most, right? I mean, there are some people who will care most about the fact that a lot of the problems of wolves being killed is at the behest of livestock operators, right? It's to protect cattle. And a lot of people, when they realize that, they'll realize, oh, wait, there's a connection between this food that maybe I don't need as much of as I thought that I did, and my favorite wild animal. There are other people who are very concerned about the impacts on freshwater streams or on our oceans that are associated with agriculture. And so it's finding that thing that people are most passionate about and starting from that point, not necessarily from the thing that you are most passionate about, because that might not be what connects with them. And then the other piece is starting with, what is it that people feel that they can do now? Because changing the way that we eat, because of the way it's so tied into our lives, can be very challenging. And in a lot of places, there can be a problem of access to fresh and healthy food and different types of cuisines. So, there might be somebody who's like, I often hear these things like, I could never go vegan because I love cheese, or I could never give up bacon, right? And when I'm talking to people about thinking about more sustainable diets, it's always like, okay, well, then don't give up bacon today if that's the thing that you really can't give up. Think about what are the things that you can do. Like, can you try plant-based milk instead of creamer in your coffee? Or, can you try, bean tacos instead of beef tacos on, your next taco night, right? Like, I mean, those are the kinds of things like getting people to see where are the small shifts so that it helps normalize it. The one other thing that you mentioned that I want to go back to as well is, you had mentioned this barrier of people feeling like, I don't necessarily know if I can stand up.
Yeah.
And you had also brought up the important issue earlier about differences in access and differences in privilege. And sometimes making changes, even when we're talking about things like diet, but also this more politically active sort of advocacy, it can be more dangerous for some people than for others, depending on their communities and their backgrounds and where they are. So I think that that's something to recognize. It's important to listen to people's fears and concerns and their barriers, and to think about where are there places where you can step up with people if it's safer for you to do so, and what are the types of actions and respect those actions that people can do where they still feel safe doing it.
That's so huge. Yes, I completely agree, Stephanie. And in that respect too, it's like people with different identities and different abilities have really valuable gifts to bring to an approach that includes, well, multiple approaches. I mean, we need people
Absolutely.
to take a myriad of approaches. We need people to obviously like local, state, national, global approaches, people looking at issues from different lenses, but also to look at activism, advocacy, education, all these different ways of helping things along and improving the situation for others, not just our own species. Um, it helps to recognize, well, it's not just being visible on social media. It's not just marching with a sign or confronting, it's not just resistance. It can be reform. And we have a program called Water Protectors Training Camp that uses the butterfly model. And we talk about, well, what does it mean to resist? How are there a lot of different ways to practice resistance? And being a reformer, how can we reform the institutions and the sectors that we already belong to? And what are the sectors that we belong to? Do you have a library card? Do you go to a school? Are you an alumni at a school? How could we potentially leverage our belonging that already does exist to advocate for something that's important to us? And then building new systems, building new ways of being, thinking out ahead of the collapse of what is to building what comes next. And then healing is another big part of it, where how can we heal ourselves and each other? How can we use art and creativity and, the culinary arts, the healing arts to, and maybe part of it is recognizing the people in our community that are doing the work and finding ways to support them, seeing what are their needs, what is a way that I can be of benefit to someone that I see giving benefit. And sometimes when you're just starting out on your path, you don't see those people as accessible even. And I remember that as a musician, it's like, wow, there's this person and they're on this pedestal or they're unapproachable. But a lot of times in activism, the people who have been in it for a while are really craving the next generation to come in. And that's where I think translating that is important, where it's like, no, not only are we accessible, we're really craving the ability to pass the torch and the ability to share our awareness and grow in our skill set. And grow in ways that the next generation knows more about what's coming next than we might. And it's a powerful thing when we can kind of break through the ice in those ways, and to do so in a way, like you said, that's safe for us and in some ways liberatory for us, that is bound in our own liberation. Turning passion into action, again, love it. So
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I agree with all of that. And I think that, these are such long haul fights. We need fresh ideas. We need different perspectives. We need that creativity and the different abilities that people can bring into this. I mean, there's no way that any of us, if we just sit there stagnant in old ideas and in a very narrow viewpoint of how we can create this change, it's not going to happen. So that having that like larger and inclusive and welcoming and curious movement is so important for creating the change that's needed.
absolutely, I love that. Curiosity is a big one for me these days. Every day I have to remind myself to stay curious, and that
Yeah.
gotten me out of a number of ruts just in the last couple of days. But I have to keep practicing.
Yeah, same here.
Yeah. Yeah. So let's get into a little bit more of the minutia of your current work with the Center for Biological Diversity. And if you could kind of break down some of the approach and the programs and what you're up to now and where you see that going, and also how people might be able to plug in and stay connected with the organization.
Yeah, so there are three main areas that my program works on. And one of them is working on our population work, which is really work looking at the intersections between reproductive rights and justice, gender equity, and and our impact on the environment. And that's something that really goes both ways. It looks at the connections between reproductive health and environmental health, and how, bodily autonomy is connected to pressures on the environment, and how all of these things really fit together. And at the end of the day, that a world where people have the right to choose if and when to have children, and where people have access, everyone has access to education, and where there's gender equity, we're going to have a stronger world and a more sustainable world for people and for wildlife. This is how we create a world where everybody can thrive. So that's one piece for our work, is really helping people understand those connections and really bridge the gaps between the environmental movement and the reproductive rights movement. And there's just so much overlap there. And people are seeing more and more of that lately, as as the threats to both have grown, and often by the same people who are threatening both the environment and reproductive rights. And so that's a big piece of the work. Another part of our work is we look at overall the impact of consumption on the environment and on wildlife. And this is, similar to that children's book series that I have, that Planet Human, is really looking at how our growth economy and this push for endless growth is really crowding out other species and destroying the natural world. And that's obviously a very big topic. But one of the things that we are doing in there is really starting to highlight what it would look like for us to actually have a major economic shift. So it's not just this capitalist growth economy, but really looking at what are some of these more community-based economic models that are already out there. And a lot of this exists in things like, CSAs and co-ops and mutual aid groups, and we have a lot of this, and really helping people understand how those things actually create a more resilient world, and a world that's better for people. So that's a big piece of, what we're working on the economic side. And then the third piece, which is a huge undertaking, is food system transformation. And this is where we do a lot of our work. We talked a little bit about it around like diet shifts, but we are also looking at it in this really systematic way of how industrial agriculture, and particularly industrial animal agriculture, since that has a far greater environmental impact than any other product, how that is really destroying the environment, really threatening even our food security, and how we can start to transition to a more humane and sustainable and equitable food system. And so there's a lot of work that we do around that, and it's both on the production and the consumption side. And I think, we talked a bit about diet, but, one thing that I always like to emphasize is that what we eat is not entirely about individual choice. A lot of people, when we talk about this, they're like, oh, well, you're just telling people what to eat. And it's like, no, there's a huge web of policy and structures that determine what we eat. It has to do with what's available and what's affordable and what's accessible to people. So we think that we're making these choices, but they are really defined by these boundaries of policy. So a lot of the work that we do is to shift those boundaries in favor of more sustainable diets.
Yes, I love that. And I'm so glad you lifted up some of these existing solutions too, because I think most people recognize we need major shifts. But sometimes it's difficult to acknowledge how are these shifts underway, or what are some ways that I can breathe life into the shift by the things that I'm already doing in my own community. And CSA is such a wonderful thing, and it has some pretty deep roots here in Michigan. And a lot of people who have some big disagreements on other issues can come together around supporting local farmers. I mean, that is some pretty strong common ground in rural America. And supporting small farmers through CSA is a deeper way to support them. And then in terms of like, the cooperative model, that in itself is like a way to exist in consumer capitalism, but to give power back and ownership literally back to the people who are doing the work and running the organization, while still being embedded in the system that we're in. And then I think you mentioned mutual aid, and during the pandemic, it was amazing to see how quickly mutual aid networks popped up just organically, and people came together to meet the needs of their communities when the systems shut down or the systems um, failed to meet our needs, and how quickly it was like, oh, mutual aid, and a lot of people had never heard of it before, and all of a sudden they were benefiting from it or participating in it, and it was in a time of uncertainty and crisis, in a time of groundlessness and not knowing what the next day or week was going to look like. And it sort of brings us back to our shared humanity. And I feel that as a real common thread in the way that you approach facing some catastrophic realities that are a part of our daily awareness, to turn toward um, shared humanity and sort of life-giving approaches, um, and principled approaches too. And I remember being at U of M and being in a we were, it wasn't an official co-op, but it was kind of a co-op vibe, like 9 people living in a 5-bedroom house on Ann Street. We called it the House of Hope and Mercy. And I remember I was just getting to know one of my roommates who was a friend of a friend, and he was a vegetarian. And I asked him about his motivation for becoming a vegetarian. Is it because of your feelings about animals? And is it like animal rights issues? And he said, more than that, it's land use issues. It's me looking at the way land is used for industrial agriculture and how resource intensive it is to have, um, and just how uh, unreasonable and horrific it is to be cutting down the air we breathe and depleting the soil that we need to give us life in favor of something that is uh, profoundly unrealistic, and within a system that in itself, like you've said, is pretty also profoundly unrealistic, in that it is sort of built on this illusion of unlimited growth and unlimited exploitation of human and natural resources. So when you start to have a principled conversation with someone who's taking a principled stance, reason comes into play beyond some of these fixed narratives that we are operating in, and increasingly so we're living in these media environments that are so incredibly self-reinforcing and becoming more, we got the reverb turned all the way up in our echo chambers now, and so these narratives become stronger and stronger. And yet when you have a human interaction with someone who's come to a principled decision through their own process of reason, we can start to get a little bit more. Um, well, I think it's also someone's story is hard to argue with. Someone's telling you their own story without trying to assassinate your character or your belonging in your community. It's like, this is how I arrived at where I am. Then where I'm at, then we can start to make some of our own decisions wiggle a little bit. It's like, well, maybe with this new information, I can shift a little bit here, and some of my patterns can become adjusted based on this new awareness that I have from this person that's my friend. Now that I know who they are, now that I have a little bit more of a glimpse of their story, and also being someone that works with young people, it's more workable with younger people who are very much in touch with their shared humanity and very much in touch with a sense of fairness that's part of who we are as human beings. Um, and so it's great. And so looking at, population and sustainability, going back to your work, I'm wondering if we can bring it back to water here and look at, water being, of course, the source of life, the thing that we need most. Water is life. Water itself is alive. And so a lot of the ways that our food systems impact our health, and they impact soil health, they impact the health of our water and the quality of our water. So I'm wondering, Stephanie, in the sort of home stretch of our interview here, if we can connect back some of the way that this work um, impacts water and can be something that people can see as something that supports the water that we drink, the water that our children need to survive, and the water that we also um, it's beyond just our drinking and staying alive through good clean drinking water, but also our relationship with the wild and the natural world and the places where we swim and go canoeing, and we connect with our stories and the story of who we are and who our people are.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, there's so many different directions we could take this because, of course, every industry has some impact on water. It uses water, it, often dumps things into water. But actually, when we look at industrial animal agriculture, that is one of the biggest culprits and perhaps one of the best lenses to look at this through. There are two ways that animal agriculture affects water, and one is the enormous amount of water that it uses. I mean, more than half of all water in the United States that's used is estimated to go towards animal agriculture. And we see this in, very particular ways, particularly, like out west where there's so much drought happening. Like one good example that came up recently is there's a recent study showing that the biggest culprits that are depleting the Great Salt Lake are hay and alfalfa that are being grown to feed beef and dairy cattle. And in this situation, which, is emblematic of what we see across the country, not only is all of this water going towards animal agriculture, leaving less for other farmers to use and less for residents and public use, but it's creating a serious health threat. And we see this happening in, other places where like water is being depleted. And of course you can, wind up seeing between the depletion and the pollution, things like algae blooms, and you can see these threats to wildlife when there's not enough fresh water, when the ecosystem becomes degraded because of all of this water use. In Great Salt Lake, for example, there's also a very clear health threat because as the lake is being depleted, there are all these toxins in the lake bed. And so there's threats, there are going to be all these toxins becoming airborne. And so much of that, again, just ties back to this one industry that is playing such a big role in depleting the water there. And again, that's something that we see across the country where that water use is just so disproportionate for, it's going towards the animal agriculture industry compared to any other industry. And the second way that animal agriculture affects our waterways is what you mentioned, is through the enormous amount of pollution. And this is really from start to finish in what happens through meat and dairy production. So from feed crops that are being doused with pesticides that run off into waterways and contaminate those waterways, to manure pollution when the animals are on the ground, to the pollution that's coming from slaughterhouses. There's an incredible amount of pollution, that's coming from slaughterhouses into our waterways. And all of that, it's deadly for the wildlife that rely on those waterways. It's harmful and toxic to people who want to use those waterways, whether that's for recreation or as their sources of drinking water. I mean, if it's not healthy enough for freshwater species like fish and salamanders and freshwater mussels to survive in, it's not going to be healthy enough for human communities either. And then through that pollution, it's not only the water itself, but of course, the water is central to this wider ecosystem, right? To the wetlands that surround it, to the plants and the migrating birds that also rely on these waterways. So we see this widespread effect that's happening just based on all of the pollution from this one industry. And that's mostly talking about freshwater, but we also know that animal agriculture is responsible for these dead zones in the ocean too, that is also tied to the runoff and pollution coming primarily from animal agriculture into the ocean. And and there's a whole other conversation we can have about fishing and marine life and how that's affecting our ocean ecosystems as well. But really, throughout the entire system, it's not only unsustainable, but the system is basically eating itself. It needs this water to continue producing meat and dairy, and it's depleting the water sources. Just like you mentioned with the soil, like the soil is needed to grow feed crops, to grow the forage. And as the soil is being destroyed, that's no longer available. So, there's a limit that is built into the fact that we live on a finite planet. We can't have infinite growth. We can't have infinite depletion and destruction of these natural resources and these habitats and ecosystems.
Mm. Thank you so much. And so bringing it into a little personal inspiration to end the interview with, and as well to help people stay connected and learn more and continue the journey with you. I'm wondering if you can share. So a couple things. I like to learn about all of us who try to stand up for the wild and to try to do what we can to protect the environment. We have a connection with the wild and with the environment, and that's personal and usually life-giving when we need it. And I'm thinking for you specifically, Stephanie, having written Nature's Secret Superheroes, I'm wondering if you can share a body of water or a place in nature that is special to you in a personal way, and maybe an animal or a species that you are drawing inspiration from at this stage in your journey that you can sort of invoke to help you take action steps forward.
Yeah, absolutely. And those are actually going to be two different things because again, my love of wildlife and the environment is broad. And although my love and my connection to water started in the Midwest because I did live in Michigan for so long, I moved out to the Pacific Northwest almost 10 years ago, and I love the wild rivers and the waterfalls out here are just incredible. There's something to me about that power and about really seeing not only the way that the water defines the environment around it in that way and transforms it, but we also have these really beautiful mossy trees and ferns and all these very all of this amazing foliage and life around this wet environment that we have up here. And so that connection of how that infuses everything around here, and then we have these just really incredible waterfalls is something that I personally draw a lot of inspiration from. Like I love to get out. If there is a hike that has a waterfall on it, like I am there. Like I just want to see, and connect with that waterfall and with the environment around it and just see how it shapes everything. And it really is something that I find humbling, when you see that, that kind of power and impact and beauty. It's really humbling about our place in the world as people and also like, everything we need to do to protect it. So that's sort of my love of water, right now.
Mhm.
For a species, one that's been on my mind a lot lately is the monarch butterfly. And in
Mm.
part, it's because we're doing a lot of work right now on how the avocado industry is affecting monarch butterflies because avocados being grown in Mexico, there's been this huge amount of expansion of the avocado industry in Mexico that is affecting the forest down there where monarch butterflies overwinter after their incredible migration
Mm.
down south. Uh, so, there's so much about monarch butterflies that obviously they're beautiful and they're enchanting little creatures. But they also are these really resilient, amazing species. And they really represent so much of what we've been talking about today with that like connection and that sense of, of like culture and diversity and how they tie into our world because they have this migration that can be thousands of miles from as far north as Canada down to the forests of Mexico, where they congregate in this just incredible spectacle before in the spring they come back up and are part of gardens. They've been part of so many people's childhoods across the US. And so I think monarch butterflies are just a really inspirational, gorgeous little creature. And they are so tied into these agricultural issues, not just the avocados, but on their migration, the pesticides that are used on feed crops, largely for animal agriculture, are one of the major threats to them when they are, up throughout North America. So, that's one that really ties into it. And I think that that's where there's a lot that we can do as individuals when we think about, the food choices we're making, as well as, what's going on in our own garden, whether you actually have a garden or you're just thinking about the chemicals are you using around your property. Like there are just so many things in our day-to-day lives that we can do just thinking about this one species that can make the world a little bit better for them and, and give them a fighting chance at survival.
Mm. Thank you so much. Yeah, you really spoke to my story with both of those too. I grew up on a farm in northern Michigan, northern Lower Peninsula, and we've always had a lot of milkweed and a lot of monarchs coming around. And I'm aware of the threat to the species, and I have always just kind of been enchanted by the beauty of butterflies, and also just a deep respect and acknowledgement of the incredible benefit of pollinators like butterflies. And we have honeybees on the farm too. And my mom and sisters live in Portland, and we were just there for a little vacation, and we went out into the Columbia River Gorge and did the Latrell Falls hike, and those waterfalls, Multnomah Falls, and just the scale, like how grand the falls are there. Having like fallen in love with like a UP waterfall tour that I try to do. My mom took me on as a kid, and now I take my daughter Iris. Then we go out to the Columbia River Gorge, and it's like, wow, Dad, the waterfalls are bigger and the mosses are brighter, and it's just a whole other, and it inspires awe, and also it's that connection that we have to keep alive to keep us resourced and also in touch with what it is we're protecting and what we're standing up for. And I'll bring in the dragonfly. Dragonflies for me have been big, and it's a symbol of the resistance of the Armenian people. And my mom sent me a painting of a dragonfly that she did in the neighborhood where she grew up. The house where she grew up, the house that she grew up in, burned in the fires in Altadena and Pasadena. And so again, like connecting to the age that we're living in and the crises that we're facing and the reality of climate change and all the forms that it takes. And also the fact that we come from people who navigated difficult times and kept that thread of humanity alive. And we see it in the way that life persists. And we have to remember, where we came from, and also that possibilities exist in terms of where we're headed. And it's been so wonderful to connect with you and learn about your work. And it's inspiring to see the ways that you have alchemized, some looking into some really, really difficult things that I think for a lot of us, it's easier to not look at and it's easier to avoid, but the way that you have alchemized your knowledge and your willingness to courageously inform yourself into things like children's books and into courageous conversations with people who might not see things the same way as you, and to courageously recognize the shared humanity that exists beneath some of the discord that we're experiencing. Thank you for what you do, and thanks for inspiring me and our listeners by sharing your story and your work.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I've loved this conversation, and thanks for all the work that you do as well.
Well, my pleasure. And in closing, Stephanie, how can we stay in touch? How can we follow what you do?
Yeah, so I encourage you to check out the Center for Biological Diversity's website. It's biologicaldiversity.org. You can sign up for our newsletter there. We also have specific newsletters on that site related to my program that's called PopX, and one that's related to a deeper dive into food issues, and that one's called FoodX. Those ones are monthly, and then the organization has a weekly newsletter where we get a lot of our updates on our endangered species protection work and some of the other work happening throughout the organization. So I encourage you to check those out. We do also have a website called Take Extinction Off Your Plate, and it's just takeextinctionoffyourplate.com. And there you can really get that overview on ways to dig deeper, specifically into our food systems work. You can check out some of the, main issues that we work on, and in steps for you to get involved and start creating change in your own life and community as well.
Fantastic. Well, many blessings and many waterfalls in your future, and keep up the good work.
Thank you so much.